The rats came in September. They came the way they always came to the settlements along the Nordfjord, in the holds of trading ships, in the bilge of fishing boats, in the bundles of fur and wool that moved between the coastal villages as the autumn trading season wound down. They were brown and fast and clever, and they had survived the crossing from the southern ports by eating their way through whatever was stored near them. Normally, a few rats in a settlement was nothing, a nuisance, something to set traps for, something the cats would handle, something that cost a family a few pounds of grain per winter and nothing more. But the rats that arrived at Grindavik in the autumn of that year were not a few. They were a plague. The first signs appeared in the granary behind Jarl Thorstein's great hall. His steward, a meticulous man named Brand, opened the main storage room one October morning and found the floor covered in droppings. Not a scattering, a carpet, dense, fresh, unmistakable evidence that something had been living in the granary in numbers that Brand had never seen. He pulled the cover from the nearest grain sack and found it shredded. The burlap was torn in a dozen places, the grain spilling through the holes like sand through a sieve, and in the grain itself, inside the sack, burrowed deep, were nests, shredded fabric, dried grass, and grain packed into tight balls, each one containing 5 or 6 blind, pink, squirming pups. Brand checked every sack in the room, 42 sacks of barley, the foundation of Grindavik's winter food supply. 31 of them had been penetrated. The rats had eaten their way through the burlap. I consumed the grain from the inside out and used the remainder as nesting material. What had been 1,000 pounds of barley was now 600 pounds of contaminated grain, mixed with droppings, urine, and the remains of nests that had been established weeks ago while Brand had assumed the granary was secure. He reported to Jarl Thorstein immediately. Thorstein's response was predictable. Seal the building, set traps, kill every rat you find, move the remaining grain to the salt house where the stone floor will slow them down. Brand did all of these things. He sealed the granary with pitch and iron plate. He set 50 traps baited with fish scraps. He killed 11 rats the first night, and he moved the remaining grain, the 600 pounds of questionable barley that was all that remained of the original 1,000, to the salt house, a stone building with thick walls and a slate floor that Thorstein believed would stop the rats from getting in. It did not stop them. Rats do not need a door. They need a gap the width of a man's thumb, a crack in mortar, a space beneath a threshold, a hole where a drain pipe enters a wall. They found their way into the salt house within 3 days. Brand discovered the evidence the same way he had discovered it in the granary. Droppings on the floor, shredded sacks, nests inside the grain. The rats were not deterred by stone. They were not deterred by traps. They were not deterred by anything that Grindavik's 140 residents could do, because the rats were operating on a biological imperative that was older than any building technique and more relentless than any man. They were breeding, and they needed food, and the grain was there. By November, the rat infestation had spread to every storage building in Grindavik. Every granary, every barn, every root cellar, every smokehouse. The rats found the grain. They found the dried fish. They found the root vegetables in their bins, and the apples in their barrels, and the seed stock for the spring planting. They found everything that was stored above ground, and they ate it, or contaminated it, or nested in it until it was unfit for human consumption. This was the situation that Astrid Vidarsdottir had been preparing for since she was 19 years old. Astrid was not from Grindavik. She had come to the settlement 6 years ago as the wife of Orm Halvorsen, a farmer of modest means who held 40 acres of decent grazing land and a fishing boat that leaked in anything worse than a gentle swell. Orm was a kind man, patient and steady, but he was not ambitious. He farmed the way his father had farmed and his grandfather before that, above ground, in buildings, using the same methods that everyone else used, because those methods had always worked. Astrid had different ideas. She had grown up in a settlement on the eastern coast, a place called Skallagrim's Landing, where the soil was thin and the winters were harsh, and the one advantage the people had was the dense, clay-rich earth beneath their feet. Her mother, a woman named Joran, had taught her that the earth was the best storehouse that existed, better than any building a man could raise, because the earth did not leak and did not burn and did not let rats in. If you have been watching Saga of Survival for a while, you know that the people who endure are never the ones doing what everyone else does. They are the ones who listen to someone older and wiser when no one else was listening. Astrid had listened, and what she had heard would save every family in Grindavik from starvation. Joran had taught her daughter the technique of pit storage when Astrid was 14. The principle was simple. You dig a pit, deep, 6 feet minimum, 8 feet if the soil allows it. You line the pit with clay, packed thick and smooth, creating an airtight seal that neither moisture nor vermin can penetrate. You fill the pit with grain, packed tight, with no air gaps. You seal the top with more clay, then turf, then stone. The grain, sealed in the anaerobic environment of the deep earth, enters a state of suspended preservation. The lack of oxygen prevents mold. The thick clay walls prevent rats. The constant temperature of the earth prevents the cycles of warming and cooling that cause grain to sweat and rot in above-ground storage. The pit breathes once, Joran had told her, when you open it. Until then, the grain sleeps. Astrid had dug her first storage pit the summer after she married Orm. He had watched her with the bemused tolerance of a husband who has decided that some battles are not worth fighting. "You are digging a hole," he said. "I am digging a granary." Granaries are buildings, Astrid, with walls and roofs and doors. Granaries are places where grain is stored. This is a place where grain will be stored. Therefore, it is a granary. Orm had the wisdom to recognize an argument he would not win. He helped her dig. Together, they excavated a pit 8 feet deep and 6 feet across, circular, with sloped walls that tapered slightly toward the bottom. Astrid lined it with clay from the riverbank, layering it thick, 4 inches on the walls, 6 inches on the floor, and letting each layer dry in the sun before applying the next. The process took 3 weeks. When it was finished, the pit was a smooth, hard-walled chamber in the earth, cool and dry, and as airtight as a sealed barrel. She filled it in September, after the harvest. 300 pounds of barley, poured in through the opening at the top, packed down with a wooden tamper until the grain was dense and solid and level with the surface. She sealed the top with a clay cap, 4 inches thick, scored with a cross so she could find it again under the turf. She covered the clay with turf and the turf with stones and the stones with more turf until the pit was invisible, just another patch of grass in the field behind the farmhouse. "How do you know the grain will keep?" Orm asked. "My mother showed me. She opened a pit that had been sealed for 3 years. The grain was perfect, not a single kernel lost to rot or mold or vermin. The earth held it the way the earth holds everything, quietly, steadily, without change. Orm shrugged. They had grain in the barn too, stored the normal way in sacks on a raised wooden floor. If Astrid wanted to bury some extra in the ground, that was her business. He did not believe it would work. He did not believe it would fail. He simply did not think about it much at all. That was 6 years ago. Every year since, Astrid had dug another pit. She now had 6 of them, spread across the back field, each one holding between 200 and 400 pounds of grain, sealed and buried and invisible beneath the grass. Total underground stores, approximately 1,500 pounds of barley, enough to feed a dozen families for months. The first year had been the hardest, not because of the digging, but because of the talking. Gunnar, the farmer on the adjacent land, had watched Astrid dig the first pit from across the fence line with the open curiosity of a man who has nothing better to do in September. "What are you building?" he called. "A granary." "That is a hole." "That is a granary that happens to be underground," Gunnar had told his wife. His wife had told the women at the well. The women at the well had told their husbands. By the end of the week, the entire settlement knew that Orm Halvorsson's eastern wife was digging holes in the back field and calling them granaries, and the consensus was unanimous. The woman was eccentric at best and mad at worst. The mockery was not cruel. It was the casual, unthinking ridicule that communities direct at anyone who does something unfamiliar. People smiled when they saw Astrid. They made jokes about planting grain and expecting it to grow underground like turnips. Torkel, the merchant who ran the trading post, asked Orm one evening whether his wife also stored firewood underwater and kept her cattle in the sky. Orm had shrugged. He had learned in 6 years of marriage that Astrid operated on information he did not have, from a tradition he did not understand, and that the safest course was to help when she asked and stay out of the way when she did not. He helped her dig. He helped her carry clay from the riverbank. He helped her tamp the grain and seal the caps. And when the neighbors laughed, he shrugged, because he had discovered that shrugging was the correct response to people who mocked things they had never tried. The second pit went in the following autumn, then the third, then the fourth. Each year, Astrid refined the technique. She discovered that deeper pits kept grain better than shallow ones, that the clay from the bend in the river was denser and sealed tighter than the clay from the bank, that scoring the cap with a distinctive mark made it easier to find in the snow, and that covering the top with a flat stone before the turf prevented the cattle from trampling the seal when they grazed the back field. She also discovered something her mother had not told her, because Joran had lived in a settlement where everyone used the technique, and there was no need to explain it. Astrid discovered that underground grain improved with age. The barley she opened after 2 years was better than the barley she opened after 1. The texture was firmer. The flavor was cleaner. The bugs and weevils that inevitably appeared in above-ground grain, the tiny larvae that hatched from eggs laid in the field long before harvest, had died in the anaerobic environment of the sealed pit. The grain was not just preserved, it was purified. She told Orm. Orm shrugged. She told no one else. By the 6th year, the pits were simply part of the farm's routine. Astrid dug 1 new pit each summer, filled and sealed it each September, and maintained the older pits by checking the turf covering and replacing any stones that had shifted. The total capacity had grown steadily, and she had begun to think of the back field not as a grazing pasture, but as a granary, an invisible, underground granary that held more grain than most families' barns and was proof against every threat that the surface world could produce. Above ground, in the barn, she kept the same amount that everyone else kept. This was important. Astrid had learned from her mother that the worst thing you could do was be seen as different before the crisis came. People who were visibly prepared were treated with suspicion in good times and with resentment in bad times. The trick was to look exactly like everyone else. Same barn, same sacks, same quantity, and to keep your real stores hidden where no one would think to look. The only person who knew the full extent of what was underground was Orm. And Orm, bless him, had the particular gift of a man who could know an extraordinary thing and behave as though he did not know it at all. When the neighbors compared their stores in autumn, as they always did, the casual, competitive accounting that farming communities engage in as the cold approaches, Orm reported the same numbers as everyone else: 1,000 pounds of grain, 200 pounds of dried fish, enough for a standard winter. Nobody asked about the back field. Nobody noticed the 6 patches of slightly different grass, the 6 flat stones, the 6 barely visible depressions in the earth that marked the caps of the pits below. Why would they? The grain was in the barn. Everyone's grain was in the barn. That was where grain lived, until the rats arrived. Now, before we go further, if you have been watching Saga of Survival and these stories of preparation speak to you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It takes a second, and it is free. Stay with me, because what Astrid's mother taught her is the reason an entire settlement survived what comes next. The rats found Astrid's barn in November, the same week they found everyone else's. She came in one morning to find the familiar evidence: droppings, shredded sacks, nests in the grain. Orm swore and set traps. The traps caught 6 rats the first night. The next morning, there were fresh droppings on top of the dead bodies. The colony was replacing its losses faster than the traps could kill them. By December, the barn was effectively empty. The rats had consumed or contaminated every sack of grain. The smoked fish was gone. The dried meat was gone. The root vegetables in the cellar had been gnawed into inedible ruins. Astrid stood in the empty barn and calculated what remained: some butter in a sealed stone crock, a barrel of ale that the rats could not breach, and the dried herbs hanging from the rafters that the rats had not yet discovered, and 1,500 pounds of barley, 6 feet underground, sealed in clay, untouched and untouchable. Orm stood beside her in the barn, looking at the destruction. The floor was covered in droppings. The sacks were shredded. The wooden bins where the root vegetables had been stored were gnawed through. The wood splintered and broken, the carrots and turnips reduced to gnawed stumps and scattered peelings. "The pits," he said quietly. It was not a question. "The pits," she confirmed. "When?" "Not yet, not until they need it." "They need it now, Astrid. They are worried now. That is not the same as needing it. When Thorstein calls a thing and admits the stores are gone, then they need it. If I go to him now, he will argue. He will say there is still time to trap the rats, still time to trade with the southern settlements, still time to find another solution. He will waste weeks looking for alternatives, because admitting that the settlement is dependent on a woman who buries grain in holes is more than his pride can tolerate." Orm looked at his wife. He had learned years ago that she thought further ahead than he did. that she calculated consequences the way he calculated feed for the livestock, practically, systematically, without sentiment. And if people die while you wait? Astrid's face tightened. This was the part that her mother had not prepared her for. Joran had taught her the technique and the timing, but Joran had lived in a community where underground storage was normal, where no one needed convincing, where the pits were as accepted as the barns. Astrid lived in a community where the pits were a joke, and the gap between the joke and the acceptance was a gap that only desperation could bridge. "No one will die," she said. "Not yet. The contaminated grain can still be sifted. The families with cattle can slaughter early. Thorstein's household has reserves he has not counted. We have 3 weeks, maybe 4, before the real hunger begins. I will not wait longer than that." She was right about the timeline. December ground on. The families of Grindavik sifted their contaminated grain, picking out the droppings and the nest material and the chewed kernels, salvaging what they could from what the rats had left. Some families slaughtered livestock early, a cow here, a few sheep there, gaining a week or 2 of meat, but sacrificing the animals they would need for milk and wool in the spring. Others tried hunting, sending men into the frozen forests above the settlement to look for deer and hare and whatever else moved in the December cold. The hunting was poor. The deer had moved to lower ground, and the hares were thin and scarce. The conversations in the village shifted week by week. In October, the talk had been of annoyance. "The rats are a nuisance. We will trap them. It will be fine." In November, the talk was of concern. "The rats are worse than we expected. The stores are lower than they should be. We should be careful." In December, the talk was of fear. "The grain is nearly gone. The fish is nearly gone. The livestock are being killed for meat that should have lasted into spring. We are running out." Astrid listened to these conversations. She participated in them. She expressed the same worry that everyone else expressed, because maintaining the appearance of being in the same situation as everyone else was essential to the plan. If she appeared calm while everyone else was frightened, people would ask questions. If she appeared well-fed while everyone else was going hungry, people would demand answers. The pits needed to remain secret until the moment when the secret would be received as salvation, rather than as proof that Astrid had been hoarding while others starved. It was a delicate line. Astrid walked it every day for 6 weeks. She waited. She did not go to the village and announce that she had food. She did not approach Jarl Thorstein and offer to help. She waited because her mother had taught her that the time to reveal your preparation was not when people were worried. It was when they were desperate. Worried people argue. Desperate people listen. The desperation arrived in January. Thorstein called an emergency thing on the 15th of January, a gathering of every household in Grindavik. The atmosphere was grim. People stood in the hall with the hollow faces of hunger, their children pressed against their legs, and their eyes fixed on the Jarl with the particular intensity of people who are looking for someone to blame. Thorstein reported the numbers. Grain stores across the settlement were down to roughly 200 pounds. At minimum rations, that would last 3 weeks. The fishing had been poor. The winter storms had made the fjord too dangerous for the small boats, and the 2 large boats that had attempted the outer water had both been driven back by ice. There was no food coming from outside. There was no food coming from trade. There was no food, period, unless someone had a source that no one else knew about. Does anyone have stores that have not been reported? Thorstein asked. The question was pro forma. Everyone knew the rats had been everywhere. Astrid stood. 140 pairs of eyes turned to her. I have grain, she said. The silence that followed was absolute. Not the comfortable silence of a pause in conversation, but the airless, charged silence of 140 people who have just heard something impossible. Where? Thorstein asked. Underground, in storage pits, sealed in clay. The murmuring started immediately. She could hear the words. Foolish, impossible. Grain cannot be stored in the ground. The moisture would rot it. The cold would freeze it. The woman is confused. How much? Thorstein asked, cutting through the noise. 1,500 pounds, 6 pits, all sealed for at least a year. The grain is dry, clean, and untouched by vermin. Thorstein stared at her. Show me. They walked to Astrid's farm in a procession that included half the village. The path was narrow and deep with packed snow, and the line of people stretched back 200 yards, silent and orderly, walking with the deliberate pace of people who have learned to conserve energy because they are not sure where their next meal is coming from. Children rode on their parents' shoulders. Old men leaned on sticks. Dogs padded alongside, thin and hungry themselves, sniffing at the air for any trace of food. Astrid led them to the back field. The field was white, featureless, a smooth expanse of snow that looked like every other field on every other farm in Grindavik. She walked to a spot that she had marked in her memory years ago, 12 paces from the fence post, 8 paces from the lone birch tree, and began to dig with a spade. The snow came up in chunks. Beneath the snow, frozen turf. Beneath the turf, a flat stone. Beneath the stone, more turf. And beneath that, the clay cap of the oldest pit, the one she had dug 6 years ago, the first one, the proof of concept. The cap was still scored with the cross she had cut 6 years earlier, still intact, not a single crack in the surface. The clay was hard, almost like pottery, fired by years of freeze and thaw cycles into something that was as impervious as the stone above it. 140 people stood in a semicircle and watched. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the scrape of Astrid's spade and the distant cry of a gull over the frozen fjord. She broke the seal with an iron bar. The clay cracked apart in clean pieces, falling away from the grain beneath like a shell falling away from an egg. And there it was, barley, dense and golden and dry, packed tight, level, smooth, it looking exactly as it had looked 6 years ago when Astrid had tamped it down with a wooden disc and sealed it away from the world. She scooped a handful and held it out to Thorstein. He took it. He held it to his nose. He let the kernels run through his fingers, feeling the dry, hard texture of perfectly preserved barley, grain that had been underground for 6 years and looked as if it had been harvested that morning. He bit one kernel in half with his teeth. The inside was white and starchy and clean, free of the gray mold or the blue-green discoloration that would indicate spoilage. "It is good," he said, and the words came out with a kind of wonder that a man like Thorstein, a practical, unsentimental man who prided himself on understanding everything about farming, rarely allowed himself to feel. Gunnar, the neighbor who had watched Astrid dig the first pit 6 years ago and called it a hole, pushed forward through the crowd. He took a handful of grain from the pit, looked at it, smelled it, rubbed it between his palms. "How?" he said. It was not a question. It was the sound a man makes when something he was certain about turns out to be wrong. Clay, Astrid said. Clay and depth. The earth below the frost line does not change. It does not warm. It does not cool. It does not admit water or air or vermin. The grain sleeps. You can wake it up whenever you need it. Gunnar looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the grain. Then he looked at the 140 people standing behind him in the snow. I owe you an apology, he said. You owe me nothing, but you can help me open the other 5 pits. If Saga of Survival has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Your support helps us bring you more stories of Norse ingenuity and quiet vindication. Astrid opened all 6 pits that afternoon. The procession moved from marker to marker across the back field, Astrid digging and Gunnar and Orm helping with the iron bar, and at each pit the same result: grain, dry and golden and perfect, protected by the earth and the clay from everything that had destroyed the stores above ground. The grain in everyone was sound, free of contamination, free of mold, free of the droppings and nests and destruction that had ruined every above-ground store in the settlement. The earth had done what Joran said it would do. It had held the grain quietly, steadily, without change, for 6 years. Some of the women wept, not from sadness, from relief. The particular, overwhelming relief of people who have been staring at starvation for weeks and are suddenly told that there is food, real food, enough food. One woman, old Bergliot from the eastern shore, dropped to her knees in the snow beside one of the open pits and simply put her hands on the grain, feeling the dry, solid texture of it, the density of it, the proof of it. She stayed there for a long time, her hands buried in the barley, not speaking, just feeling the reality of survival beneath her fingers. The distribution began immediately. Astrid measured the grain herself, portioning it out by family size, calculating the rations to stretch the 1,500 pounds across 140 people for as long as possible. She used a wooden measure that her mother had made, carved from a single piece of alder, holding exactly 1 pound when leveled with a knife. She filled the measure. She leveled it. She poured the grain into the waiting sacks and cloth bags and aprons that people had brought. 1 pound per person per day at minimum subsistence. But Astrid knew what her mother had taught her about stretching grain. Cook it long, cook it slowly, add water to make porridge rather than bread. A pound of dry grain becomes 3 pounds of cooked porridge, and 3 pounds of porridge will sustain a body through a day of rest, if not a day of hard labor. At porridge rations, 1,500 pounds of grain would last nearly a month. She taught the women how to cook it. She taught them the proportions: 1 part grain to 4 parts water, a pinch of salt, brought to a slow boil and held there for 2 hours until the grain had absorbed every drop of liquid and expanded to 3 times its dry volume. She taught them to skim the starch water and save it for the children, because the liquid was nearly as nutritious as the grain itself and easier for small stomachs to process. She taught them to save a handful of uncooked grain from each day's ration and grind it into flour on a flat stone, making a paste that could be spread on anything, adding calories and texture to whatever other scraps the family managed to find. If you are still here, hit that subscribe button right now. It is free, takes a second, and what happens next will change everything you think you know about grain storage. The winter dragged on. January became February. February became March. The rats, having consumed everything above ground, began to starve themselves. Their numbers dropped. Their aggression increased. They gnawed at door frames and leather goods and the pitch sealing the boats. They ate candles and soap and the bindings of the few books in the settlement. They ate everything that was not stone or metal. But they did not eat the grain, because the grain was 6 feet underground, sealed in clay, and the rats could not dig through 4 inches of packed clay any more than they could dig through stone. Astrid's pits were impervious. The earth was impervious. The technique that everyone had called foolish and impossible and a waste of time was the only thing standing between Grindavik and complete starvation. The hardest week was the 3rd week of February, when the last of the supplementary foods ran out. The butter in the stone crocks was gone. The dried herbs were gone. The ale that had survived the rats was finished. The starch water that Astrid had taught the women to save was the only thing the youngest children would eat, because their stomachs had shrunk to the point where solid food caused pain. There was a day during that week, a Tuesday, gray and windless, the kind of day where the cold is not dramatic, but simply present, steady, inescapable. When Astrid sat alone in her kitchen after the children were asleep and did the mathematics one more time. She had 9 barrels of grain left. 9 barrels, approximately 700 pounds. At current rations, 17 days of food for 140 people. 17 days. And March, with its storms and its ice, showed no sign of yielding to spring. She thought about her mother. She thought about Joran, standing in the pit at Skallagrim's Landing, showing a 14-year-old girl how to pack clay and tamp grain and read the color of the earth. Joran had never imagined that her daughter would feed an entire settlement from 6 pits. She had imagined a family, a household, a small circle of people protected by the knowledge she had passed down. The scale of what Astrid was doing was beyond anything Joran had anticipated, and the mathematics was stretching the technique to its limits. But the technique held. That was the thing. The grain held. Every barrel she opened was sound. Every kernel was clean. The earth did not care how many people needed to eat. The earth simply preserved what was given to it and returned it unchanged when it was asked. Astrid went from house to house that week, checking on the families, adjusting rations, making sure the grain was being cooked properly and not wasted. She found problems and she fixed them. One family was cooking the porridge too fast, losing water to steam, producing a dense paste that was filling, but provided fewer calories per pound than the slow-cooked version. Another family was feeding equal portions to everyone, including a nursing mother who needed twice the calories of a grown man. A third family had been throwing away the starch water, not understanding that the cloudy liquid skimmed from the top of the cooking pot contained nearly a quarter of the grain's total nutrition. She corrected these mistakes patiently, without judgment, with the particular calm of a woman who has practiced her craft for so long that every problem has a known solution. Her mother had taught her these things too, not just how to store grain, but how to stretch it, how to distribute it, how to keep a community alive on rations that seemed impossibly small, but were, in fact, sufficient if handled with care. The fishing improved in late March when the storms abated. The first boats went out and came back with catches that were modest but sufficient, enough to supplement the grain rations and extend the supply by another 2 weeks. By mid-April, the spring thaw had driven the rats from the buildings and into the fields, where the cats and the hawks and the returning foxes began the slow work of reducing the colony to manageable numbers. By May, the crisis was over. The settlement exhaled. The children played outside for the first time in months. Men stood in groups on the shore, watching the boats come in, counting the fish, calculating the surplus with the reflexive caution of people who have recently been hungry. The women went back to their kitchens and cooked real meals, fish and grain, and the first green shoots from the gardens, and the sound of cooking, real cooking, not the careful measurement of survival rations, filled the houses of Grindavik like music that had been missing since October. But something had changed, something permanent. The settlement that had gone into the winter, thinking it understood food storage, came out of the winter, knowing that it did not. Every above-ground system had failed. Every barn, every granary, every salt house, every smokehouse. In every root cellar, the entire architecture of food preservation that the Norse had used for centuries had been defeated by an animal the size of a man's fist. The only thing that had worked was a hole in the ground lined with clay. That knowledge rearranged the way people thought about preparation. It rearranged the way they thought about risk. And most importantly, it rearranged the way they thought about Astrid Vidarsdottir, the quiet woman from the eastern coast who buried grain in her back field and endured 6 years of jokes without once saying, "You will need this someday." The accounting came at the spring thing. Thorstein stood before the settlement and delivered the numbers in his flat, practical voice. Total grain lost to rats above ground, approximately 4,000 pounds across all households. A total grain preserved underground in Astrid's pits, 1,500 pounds. Number of people fed from the pits, 140. Duration of pit-supplied rations, 28 days. Number of deaths from starvation during the crisis, 0. In a winter where the rats had eaten everything. In a winter where every storehouse was empty and every granary was bare and every family was hungry. 0 deaths because one woman had dug holes in a field and filled them with grain and sealed them with clay 6 years before the disaster arrived. The hall was quiet when Thorstein read the numbers. Not the tense quiet of the January thing, when people had been frightened and angry. A different quiet. The quiet of people sitting with a fact that they cannot argue with, and that changes everything they thought they knew. Thorstein looked at Astrid. "Teach us," he said. It was the shortest speech anyone had ever heard from a jarl at a thing. It was also the most important. Gunnar stood up next. The neighbor, the man who had called the first pit a hole, who had told the joke about planting grain underground. "I have a field," he said, "north-facing, good clay soil, high ground above the drainage. I would like to dig the first pit there, this summer, under Astrid's supervision, if she will have me." "I will have anyone who brings a shovel," Astrid said. The hall laughed. Not the old laughter, the mocking laughter of people who think they know better. A new laughter, the warm, relieved laughter of people who have been through something terrible together and have found, on the other side, a woman who knew the way through. That summer, Astrid held the first digging. 67 people came from Grindavik and from 3 neighboring settlements that had heard about the miracle of the underground grain. They gathered in Astrid's back field on a warm July morning, standing in a rough circle around one of the empty pits, the oldest one, the 6-year pit, its clay walls still smooth and intact after half a decade underground. Astrid climbed into the pit. She stood at the bottom, 4 feet below the surface, the clay walls rising around her, and she taught the way her mother had taught her, with her hands, with her voice, with the patient specificity of someone who knows that every detail matters. She taught them how to choose the site. High ground, away from water, where the clay was thick and the drainage was good, never near a creek or a spring or a low spot where water pooled after rain. Water was the enemy. Water dissolved clay. Water ruined seals. Water turned a storage pit into a well. She taught them how to dig, straight-sided, tapering slightly toward the bottom, 8 feet deep at minimum. The taper was important, she said, because a tapered pit shed water, if any reached the walls, channeling it downward rather than letting it pool. The depth was important because the frost line on the Nordfjord reached 3 feet in a hard winter, and grain stored above the frost line would freeze and thaw and freeze again, each cycle breaking the kernels and admitting moisture. She taught them how to line the walls. Clay from the riverbank, she said, not clay from the hillside. River clay was finer, denser, more plastic. It sealed better. You applied it wet, 4 inches thick, smoothing it with the flat of your hand until the surface was as uniform as the inside of a pot. Then you let it dry. Then you applied another layer. 4 layers minimum, each one dried before the next was added. The process took 3 weeks. She taught them how to fill. Grain poured slowly, tamped down with a wooden disc, no air pockets, level with the surface. Air was the second enemy after water. Air contained moisture. Air contained mold spores. Air contained the invisible agents of rot that would destroy grain in weeks if given access. The tamping eliminated the air. The ceiling trapped the vacuum. The earth did the rest. She answered questions for 4 hours. 67 people asked the same questions that every generation asks when it encounters a technique for the first time. Will it really work? How long does it last? What if the clay cracks? What about insects? What about frost? What if I dig too deep and hit rock? What if I dig too shallow and hit water? Astrid answered every one with the specific, practical authority of someone who has done the thing she is teaching, has done it for years, has tested it and refined it and proved it against the worst conditions the Nordfjord could produce. By the end of the day, the 67 people had been organized into digging teams. Each team would dig 3 pits before the autumn. Astrid would inspect each one before it was filled. No pit that did not meet her specifications would receive grain. This was not negotiable. A badly made pit was worse than no pit at all, because a badly made pit created the illusion of security while the grain inside rotted unseen. She told them the things her mother had told her. The grain sleeps underground. It does not age. It does not rot. It does not attract vermin. It simply waits in the dark and the cold and the silence of the earth for the day when it is needed. By the following autumn, 32 new storage pits had been dug across the settlements of the Nordfjord. Astrid had inspected every one. She had rejected 4, 2 for insufficient depth, 1 for clay that was too sandy, 1 for a location too close to a stream. And the families who had dug those pits had dug new ones without complaint, because no one questioned Astrid's judgment on this subject anymore. By the autumn after that, 70 pits. Within 5 years, underground grain storage was as common as above-ground storage, and the phrase Astrid's pits had entered the vocabulary of the region as a shorthand for any preparation that was invisible until it was needed. When someone built a precaution that others could not see, when someone prepared for a disaster that others did not believe would come, when someone did the quiet, unglamorous work of preparation while others laughed, people said, "She is digging her pit." and everyone knew what it meant. The rats returned, as rats do in later years. They came with the trading ships, and they ate what they could find. But what they could find was less and less, because the grain that mattered, the survival grain, the emergency grain, the grain that stood between a settlement and starvation, was underground, sealed in clay, beyond the reach of any creature that could not dig through packed earth to a depth of 8 feet. Orm Halvorsen, Astrid's husband, was heard to say in the ale hall one winter evening, years later, that the smartest thing he had ever done was marry a woman who talked to dirt. He said it with pride, and no one in the hall contradicted him, because every person there had eaten grain from one of Astrid's pits and knew exactly what he meant. Thank you for watching this story about Astrid and the underground granary. If it reminded you of the importance of preparation and the value of knowledge that the comfortable dismiss as eccentric, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Saga of Survival for more stories of quiet ingenuity and the people who built where no one else thought to look. Astrid Vidarsdottir lived until the age of 71, dying in the farmhouse beside the field where her 6 original pits still held grain. By the time she died, there were over 200 storage pits across the Nordfjord settlements, and the technique had spread to communities as far north as Tromsø and as far south as Bergen. Traders who visited the Nordfjord carried the knowledge home with them, and within a generation, underground grain storage was practiced along the entire western coast of Norway. Her daughter, who had learned the technique before she could read, took over the teaching sessions that Astrid had held every summer for decades. She taught her own children, and they taught theirs, and the chain of knowledge that had begun with Jorunn at Skallagrim's Landing continued unbroken through the centuries. The pits endured, the earth endured, the knowledge endured. Long after the buildings of Grindavik had rotted and been rebuilt and rotted again, the clay-lined pits in the back fields held their shape, their walls as smooth and solid as the day they were packed, waiting in the dark for grain that might never come, but would be preserved perfectly if it did. Her gravestone said only what she had asked it to say. She put it where the rats could not reach. It saved them all. What is the shelter that everyone thinks you do not have? And where have you buried your preparation?